Hello again, and welcome back to our mini-series on playing the acoustic guitar in worship. If you've skipped ahead and you've not watched the other videos, I would recommend looking them up and watching them first, because the idea is that we're building from video to video, and there's some techniques and ideas that I will refer to that are explored properly in previous videos. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at playing in a band that has two acoustic guitars. And what are some of the differences where you are playing as either the first acoustic or the second acoustic. And I'm going to try and give you some tips and pointers that will help you create a really great sound in that band setting. In most of our bands, you'll generally be the only acoustic guitar player. And in some ways, that does make it a bit more straightforward for you. That means you can go about doing what we discussed in the first videos and using all the other techniques with confidence. Generally, you'll be wanting to play in that percussive style that we've discussed throughout most of the set, just kind of emphasizing that, and adding in some variation at certain points of the song, particularly in encounter and response songs. Maybe using some of those techniques, those finger-picking plectrum techniques that we've looked at. You'll also generally want to be playing lower down the neck. You don't want to be going too high up, but actually you don't need to worry too much if the capo takes you higher up the neck, because you're the only acoustic guitar player, and you won't be conflicting with another acoustic guitarist. But if we bring in a second acoustic, this will require some further considerations. Because if you both go into the worship rehearsal and play away as you normally do, the sound of the band will generally become muddied. You may also have issues, in particular with strumming patterns that conflict. That's one of the most common issues that we have when we have two acoustics, and other little hiccups. Think back to the fraction principle in the first video. With the introduction of the second acoustic, your space in the band just got a little bit smaller. At the same time though, this is a positive, the opportunities for the band have increased, because a second acoustic adds flexibility and it adds further options. So, if a second acoustic is being added to your band, do not feel threatened, okay? Do not worry if you're not the only acoustic guitar. It's a good thing, and it will develop the sound of your band, and actually it will develop you as a guitarist. So first thing you need to do, along with the worship leader, is work out the role each acoustic guitar player is going to play. I'd advise you to work on the principle of kind of a first and second acoustic. I generally say that the first acoustic is going to be playing that kind of pretty consistent role, giving that percussive sound from the lower end of the neck. Okay, they're playing kind of the open chords without the capo. And if the worship leader is also an acoustic guitarist, it's often helpful if they take on that role. This is because generally the worship leader, which could be you, has got quite a lot to focus on. They've got to be singing, they've got to focus on their tuning, the words, leading the band, looking at the congregation, encountering the Spirit and discerning what the Spirit's doing, all those things that worship leaders do. So I'd recommend, if you're the worship leader, you take that role. Then for the second acoustic player, the job is slightly trickier, arguably. A helpful principle for you as the second acoustic guitarist, right off the bat, is you don't have to always play. I mean, it's a good principle for any musician, really. If you don't feel like you have something to add at a particular musical moment, don't feel like you need to add anything. The second acoustic can be a great way to add light and shade to songs. And by not always playing all the time, when you do come in, you help facilitate dynamic variation within the band, and you make a positive impact. At this point, it's helpful for us to also think about electric guitars, okay? And there's often two electric guitars in our band, because as well as the first acoustic guitarist, you don't want to be playing against them, and you don't want to be clashing. So make sure when it comes to mixing that you can hear really prominently not just the first acoustic guitar, but also the electric guitarist. So you might want to mix them, pan them, one in each ear. A couple of ideas for second acoustic then. Okay? Try and use different chord shapes to the first acoustic. So for example, we've got a song that's in G. The first acoustic is going to play without a capo, and they're going to be playing those G shapes. Perhaps the second acoustic should consider playing something slightly differently. So perhaps they should consider playing up the neck. So I'm going to use a capo to demonstrate what they might do. So if we're playing in G, they might use the capo higher up. So for example, they might do D shapes, okay? So they could put the guitar capo on the 4th fret and they could play D shapes. Or they could do E shapes and have it on the 3rd fret, okay? Sometimes it could be a nice contrast to go higher up the fretboard with the capo than we would for a first acoustic. So say we've got a song in D, okay? The first acoustic is playing D shapes, open, no capo. The second acoustic might then consider playing with a capo, and they might even go shock horror all the way up to the 7th fret, put it on, and then they would play G shapes. Now, as you notice, there's a different pitch, okay? And the pitch is obviously higher, but also it lends kind of a different quality to the sound. Arguably, it's more kind of like a mandolin, ukulele type quality, okay? Which might not be the vibe your worship leader is going for, okay? So it's like a Hillsong Young and Free song with all the booming synth and you're there doing your little mandolin impression. Probably not going to work, okay? But for some songs, it's exactly what you need. Okay, so use your discretion. And also, you don't have to play the full fretboard. Okay, as second acoustic, you might choose a few strings to focus on. So you might focus on just kind of playing the top 3 strings. That's absolutely fine when you're second acoustic. Some parts of the song will benefit from it. Now, strumming patterns, as always, are important, but really important when you've got 2 acoustics. General options are you either match what the first acoustic is doing, or you play something that is complementary. Now, matching like for like can work well if you're doing the different chord shapes. For example, if one of you is playing higher up the neck with a capo and one of you is playing lower down. But I would advise you're not necessarily going to want to do that throughout the whole song. You can opt for a partial matching. So say the first acoustic is playing 100% strumming pattern, you play kind of 80%, and you regularly miss out a particular beat. Complementary strumming patterns will often vary from song to song, but I'd generally be prepared as the second acoustic to play with less intensity than the first acoustic. So for example, on some songs or parts of songs, you may just want to let chords ring out and leave the percussive playing to the first acoustic. There's no harm in you just doing some nice strums and leaving them there to hang while the first acoustic is plowing away with the more regular rhythmic playing. You could also consider, when playing second acoustic, that you choose picking more often than you would as first acoustic. Sometimes it can add a really nice variation to the sound. And if the first acoustic is keeping the more rhythmic going at the lower end, that's a really great contrast. Just be aware of what else is going on in the band. For example, there might be a second electric part that involves picking, which they often do. So try and avoid playing against them. You can play something complementary, but just be aware of that. This is kind of the challenge of the second acoustic. The piano as well can often do what you might do as well. So you've got to be aware of that dynamic and aware of the whole sound of the band and be flexible. The key, though, really, is communication between you and the worship leader and the rest of the band. You might decide that actually in different songs of the set, you're going to mix up who plays which role, okay? You might want to swap who's doing the first acoustic part, who's doing the second part from song to song. That's what electric guitarists sometimes do, swapping rhythm and lead. But again, agree beforehand. Work out a plan of action before you go into that rehearsal, and particularly before the Sunday morning. Similarly, as the second acoustic, while you've got the option to be more melodic in your playing, picking out individual notes, you've got to watch out for what other people are doing, okay? The best musicians are aware of what everyone in the band is playing, and they find their place in that. And that's a skill that's important for us as second acoustic guitar players. So, In this video, we've discussed having 2 acoustic guitars in a band, and that's a blessing, but it does also require careful consideration of things like chord shapes, capo usage, strumming and picking patterns, as well as careful, clear communication and musical awareness of the sound of the band as a whole. In our final video, we're going to play through a worship song, and I'll do my best to demonstrate those tips, ideas, practices that we've discussed throughout the whole series. So please do watch that video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.